Good morning, everyone. Bright and sunny on a late fall day. We still have a few days of sun left, so we'll enjoy every moment of it. For those of you that do not know me, I'm Neil Guterman. I'm the Dean of the School of Social Service Administration here at University of Chicago. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here this morning, and glad that you could join us for Reunion Weekend. And also then for this year's Rhoda G. Sarnat lecture. Today actually marks the 10th such lecture since the founding of the Sarnat series. We inaugurated this in spring of 2005. And since that time, the Sarnat lecture has really become a really wonderful venue, part of our alumni weekend every year, and it provides a great opportunity for us to learn about some of the latest developments, of particular importance to clinical social work practice. Those of you that know Rhoda Sarnat, the Sarnat lecture was initiated a decade ago with the generous support of Rhoda and her husband Bernard. Rhoda was a longtime distinguished caseworker and field instructor at SSA. She was also a private practitioner for many years. She received her master's degree from SSA the year that World War II broke out in 1939, and had the distinctive opportunity, which only a few of us have had, to have been taught by some of the pioneers of SSA and even the pioneers of the profession of social work, I should say, Edith Abbott, Grace Abbott, and Sophonisba Breckenridge, who some of the banners we have up here are in honor of them. After she finished SSA in 1939, she had a distinguished career that spanned nearly 60 years, both here in Chicago, in St. Louis, and also in Los Angeles, where she currently resides. She and her husband, Bernard, have 2 children, 5 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren so far. And although Rhoda and her family are not able to join us today, sadly, we're very grateful to them, of course, not only for their generosity, but for the opportunity that their generosity provides us to enrich the social work community this morning through this annual lecture. For this year's Sarnat lecture, I'm really delighted that we'll have a chance to learn from my wonderful colleague and longtime SSA faculty member, Bill Borden. Professor Borden has been teaching at SSA now for more than 2 decades. He remains one of our students' most admired faculty members. He's known for helping our students in developing their clinical acumen in deep, and analytic, and sophisticated ways. And he's widely praised for his unselfish mentoring of our students, for the nurturing relationship that he builds with students, alums, and practitioners in the community, many of whom I'm sure are sitting here in the room today. Bill teaches SSA courses on psychodynamic theory and practice, comparative psychotherapy, human development, and social work practice. And he's also our lead instructor in the Advanced Psychodynamic Clinical Practice Fellowship Program, which is offered through our Professional Development and Continuing Education Program for our alums and those in the community. And in recognition for his many pedagogical talents and contributions, Bill was honored with the SSA William Pollock Award for Excellence in Teaching recently. By the way, in addition to his work at SSA, Bill has also served as a clinician and a consultant to mental health clinics and community agencies in Chicago. He continues to contribute as a prolific writer, examining advances in clinical theory and practice and their integration. And Bill's most recently been delving into some recent findings in neuroscience and how those shape and inform clinical practice, and thus I'm really excited about the title of his talk today, and honored now that we'll have a chance to hear about some of the work he's been most recently doing as he now comes and speaks to us about neuroscience, therapeutic action, and clinical pragmatism experiments in adapting to need. Will you please join me in welcoming Professor Bill Borden?
Thank you so much. It's a deep pleasure to be here this morning. It's It's such a pleasure. I was excited, and as I was just explaining, I spilled a cup of coffee down the front of my shirt and my tie. And I ran out of my office down to the washroom, trying to splash water on it, and locked myself out of my office, where my notes were. And I have them. I often call upon Donald Winnicott, who is said to have said composure is highly overrated. So I want to thank my colleagues for inviting me to speak this morning. I want to thank Wileen Modley, Maureen Stimming, Christina Gross for organizing the morning. We hand one another along in many ways as we carry out our work. And I want to thank the Sarnats for making it possible for us to meet and think together about essential concerns in our practice over the alumni weekend. I feel that these occasions are especially important in light of the ongoing challenges that we face in our hard-pressed agencies as we work to create, preserve, and restore opportunities for learning and professional development, as we work to challenge ourselves. It's wonderful to see so many former students and friends, one of whom I met in my 301 cohort 33 years ago, Linda Tartoff. As we gather on Alumni Weekend, I think of the turns of fate and circumstance that bring us into the field. I think about the experiences. I think about the essential others who shape the work that we come to carry out. And this morning, I'd like to remember two friends of SSA, two friends of our school who've been especially important to me. As many of you know, Bernice Simon died last May. She was in her 100th year. Like Rhoda Sarnat, she had been a student of Edith Abbott. Edith Abbott, as some of you maybe historically inclined may know, had lived in Hull House with her sister Grace Abbott and Jane Addams. I thought of them recently in watching the Ken Burns documentary on the Roosevelts. Edith Abbott had been a consultant to Harry Hopkins in the FDR administration. Bernice joined the faculty in 1944, about 5 years after Rhoda Sarnat had graduated. And she worked closely with Helen Perlman and Charlotte Toll. And in this sense, she continued to give us a living connection with our past, bridging us with the people and the lives and the sensibilities that have shaped the school. She had a deep appreciation of experiential learning, a deep appreciation of field work, and she thought of social work as a calling. She retired before I came to SSA in 1981, but I'd been deeply moved by an essay that she had written as a tribute to Charlotte Toll. This was really my introduction to social work. She spoke of social casework as the conscience of society. She called for a renaissance of the unity of cause and function in the profession. And her account helped me begin to imagine ways that we could work toward a more humane culture of equality and respect, where, in Bernice's words, we would value the individuality of all. I was 23 when I found it in the Strand bookstore in New York. And those of you who are familiar with it may know that it represents itself as the world's largest bookstore. And I was making my way through the psychology section and came across a shelf labeled social casework. And so I found Bernice's essay next to Charlotte Toll's book, Common Human Needs, which I would later learn had been banned by the government. It was originally a government publication that was judged to be socialist, but I found this very interesting. And Jane Addams was also there, a collection of essays. So more than 37 years later, I call upon Bernice's essay, her words, every year as I start our foundation course in social work practice. I also want to remember Bert Kohler, who died 2 years ago in May. Bert was the William Rainey Harper Professor of Comparative Human Development and in the college. He also taught in our Department of Sociology and the Divinity School, the Department of Psychiatry, sadly our former Department of Education. He also taught at the Institute for Clinical Social Work, the Institute for Psychoanalysis, and at one time he was the director of the Orthogenic School. Bert had an extraordinary range. He insisted that we call him Bert because he said we're all equal before the text and we're all equal before our experience. He cared deeply about ideas, really working to bridge understanding across the disciplines, but he cared even more about people. And he loved social work, and he loved SSA. And like Donald Winnicott, he came to think of what he was fond of calling our old-fashioned forms of social casework as the ultimate form of helping and care, because he said we can carry out our work in such flexible and concrete ways as we work to meet and match need and circumstance. He thought it very odd that clinicians would somehow think of case management and many of the activities that we encompass in the broader field of social work practice as extrinsic to a therapeutic process or a therapeutic practice. He really had an appreciation of the therapeutic practices that operate across all forms of helping in social work practice. He sent many students to us through the years, perhaps some of you. He worked closely with many of us on our master's and doctoral programs. I was in my office at the start of the quarter. A student came, introduced herself, and she said, "Bert sent me." And 2 years after his death, Bert continues as a presence, I think. And I think Bernice and Bert had an energy of mind all their own. They had a moral energy. They took ideas, they brought them to life, they showed how we could put them to use. And they, I think, enriched us beyond measure over the years, and I feel deep gratitude for their example and what they've given us. This morning, how I'd like to proceed. I'd like to say some things by way of introduction, talk about some of the larger concerns and themes and ideas that have moved me to think with you this morning about the science of mind, concepts of therapeutic action, and clinical pragmatism. Afterwards, I want to outline some orienting perspectives in the science of mind. I want to say some things about clinical pragmatism. We will take a break after probably 55 minutes or so for 15 minutes, and then we'll start again. More neuroscience. We'll talk about some clinical material and look at that in light of different concepts of therapeutic action across the foundational schools of thought. For our purposes this morning, when I talk about the foundational schools of thought, I'm encompassing the psychodynamic, the behavioral, the cognitive, and the humanistic traditions. But I'm also certainly wanting very much to think about context as well, and our surrounds. So that's what I've laid out. Those of you who've had me in class know that I always have too much material, and today's certainly no exception. What I'm going to try to do is condense and summarize, and we'll see how we proceed. I worked as a clinician now for 31 years. A lot of my teaching, a lot of my writing has focused on the place of theory in social work practice, how different traditions, different thinkers help us really shape our understanding of what is the matter, what carries the potential to help, how we call upon different ideas, different approaches as we negotiate the irreducible complexities, ambiguities, and challenges of the clinical situation. Over the years, I've come to appreciate the variety of ways in which we carry out what Donald Winnicott called experiments in adapting to need, fashioning distinctive approaches from a variety of perspectives in light of the concrete particularities of need and circumstance. In the course of our development as clinicians, I emphasize in my teaching, we have to negotiate more fundamental tensions between more pure conceptions of a helping process, a therapeutic endeavor, and more fragmentary, more limited renderings of what we do as we carry out our work. Some of us are going to search for an encompassing point of view that would promise to unify our understandings of people, problems in living, therapeutic action. Certain thinkers in the foundational schools of thought offer moving accounts of the human situation, their sense of life. They fashion grand theories that followers regard as the foundations of therapeutic practice. I think of the rich tableau of psychoanalytic thought, for example. We think of the drive psychology of Freud, the drive psychology of Melanie Klein. We think of the depth psychology of Carl Jung, the social perspective of Alfred Adler, the self-psychology of Heinz Kohut. In the classical cognitive tradition, we think of Aaron Beck, for example. In the humanistic tradition, we think of Carl Rogers and his person-centered approach. In the third wave behavioral approaches, we think of certain models that have really shaped understanding and practice more and more. For example, acceptance and commitment therapy, dialectical behavior therapy. However compelling we may find these paradigms, I think most of us in the course of our work come to appreciate the limits of any particular thinker or model, refusing to privilege any single heuristic or explanatory system, realizing that grand theories inevitably fail us as we engage the realities of our day-to-day practice. Winnicott exemplifies the pragmatic attitude in his use of ideas and methods from a range of perspectives, both within psychoanalysis and from the other schools of thought as well. He's steadfast in his focus on, again, the concrete particulars of the clinical situation. He says what matters is what works. Although most clinicians, I think, are trained in a single approach in many of our programs, most often cognitive behavior therapy, I think most of us come to assimilate ideas and methods from other schools of thought as well. Over the years, surveys have shown that most social workers endorse eclecticism as their fundamental orientation to practice. One of my student evaluations recently suggested that that I have talked about me as having an etymological tick, was the phrase. I think a lot about the origins of words, and the Greek root of the term eklektikos means selective. And in the most pure rendering of eclecticism, we assume that practitioners draw on different ideas and techniques from a range of theories and models of treatment in our efforts to formulate what we judge to be the most effective approaches. The implication is that we have been able to master a range of theories and therapeutic languages and technical procedures. But in our reviews of the clinical literature, we find very little discussion of the particular approaches that we encompass in our ranges of understanding, or the concerns and the criteria that shape the ways in which we work to engage different ideas, empirical findings, and methods over the course of our work. And my sense is that in day-to-day practice, much of what we think of as eclectic tends to underplay differences and homogenize complexities such that the powerful ideas and methods of the distinctive schools of thought lose their edge. If we are to avoid, I guess, what I think of as a willy-nilly eclecticism, I think it's crucial to establish a point of view and to formulate basic principles that guide our efforts to use different ideas, to integrate empirical findings and technical procedures in ways that we can justify and defend in light of the given case, our clinical experience, and beliefs and values and sensibilities that shape our ways of working. Otherwise, we run the risk of eclecticism by default, failing to realize the power and the efficacy of different approaches in particular cases. In some of the more recent work I've done, I've been trying to formulate what I think of as a clinical pragmatism, trying to identify basic principles and values that shape ways of thinking about experiential learning and the process of intervention. And I'm going to talk more about that shortly. But I want to shift in a minute and look at orienting perspectives in neuroscience. But again, by way of introduction, what I'm saying is that in light of my interests in clinical theory, in light of my interests in integrative and comparative approaches to practice, I've been moved to think about the ways in which recent developments in the science of mind carry the potential to strengthen our clinical formulations, to broaden the scope of our practice, to enlarge our understanding of therapeutic action across the foundational schools of thought. I think that work in neuroscience carries the potential to serve as a heuristic for integrative approaches to our work, informing the ways we think about different methods over the course of our practice. And we'll be talking more about that in the second part of the morning. Although the science of mind and the field of clinical social work differ in their fundamental concerns and projects, I think it's crucial for researchers, policymakers, teachers, practitioners to talk and to think together about the potential implications of ideas, empirical findings for training and practice, to think about how we work to relate domains of knowledge and bring findings to bear as we carry out different forms of practice. So I'd like, again, by way of an orientation, to make some general observations about emerging work in the science of mind before I return to clinical pragmatism. The science of mind has been shaped by converging lines of work in cognitive psychology, in the neurosciences. We think of fields of affective neuroscience, behavioral neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience. We think of developmental neuroscience, and we certainly think of work in other disciplines, biology, genetics, anthropology, and so on, that continue to enlarge ways of thinking about development across the course of life, ways of thinking about vulnerability, resilience, and also thinking about what we take to be facilitating processes in our work. We've moved beyond the fundamental debate of nature versus nurture in our conceptions of development. We continue to realize the ways in which the brain and the mind are shaped by a complex interplay of genetic factors and experiential opportunities in the social surround. The brain is far more plastic than neuroscientists once believed, even 5 years ago. And we appreciate more and more the crucial role of relational life and experiential learning in change and growth. You may remember the decade of the brain, the last decade of the 20th century. I began teaching a course on comparative perspectives in social work practice in 1999 and was reviewing the literature and was reading work suggesting that following the decade of the brain and the expansion of clinical neuroscience and pharmacology at the turn of the century, researchers were predicting that biomedical models of explanation and treatment would supersede the practice of psychotherapy and other forms of psychosocial intervention. What's ironic, I think, is that since then, empirical work in the science of mind only reaffirms the importance of our therapeutic practices. as we work to bring about change and growth. We think so much about the different experiential possibilities that we bring to bear over the course of social work practice. Research has strengthened the empirical foundations of all forms of psychosocial intervention, linking basic science to concepts of therapeutic action across the foundational schools of thought. From the perspective of neuroscience, we are assuming that genetic loadings, lapses in caretaking, restrictions of opportunity, and trauma potentially undermine the development of the brain, compromising the growth and integration of neural networks, predisposing us to a range of vulnerabilities and problems in functioning that we encompass in our conceptions of psychopathology. Researchers assume that vicious circles of feeling and thought and action originate or are closely linked to underdeveloped, under-regulated, or under-integrated neural networks, perpetuating chaotic or rigid patterns of behavior. If we think of the neural substrates of the talking cure, a fundamental task in our work is to generate experiential opportunities that reinstate developmental processes and strengthen the integration and regulation of neural functions believed to underlie our experience of health, well-being, and adaptive functioning. In this sense, we understand all forms of practice as sources of enriching experience that carry the potential to enhance neuroplasticity and neural integration, altering the structure and function of the brain. I'm not going to review this literature this morning, but I want to make reference to the work of Eric Kandel, who received the Nobel Prize in 2000 for his studies of aplesia, the sea slug, that has provided a conceptual model for ways of thinking about the ways in which the experiential opportunities of psychosocial intervention activate protein synthesis. And I'll say a few more things about that shortly. But what I would want to say by way of overview is that research in the fields of neurogenetics, molecular biology, and brain imaging continue to provide strong empirical support for these formulations. They document changes in gene expression, neurotransmitter metabolism, and enduring change in synaptic plasticity after courses of psychotherapy. So the experiential changes that we see over the course of our work would appear to be closely linked to changes in the structure and function of the brain. What I'm trying to do by way of overview is lay out, again, some basic assumptions and orienting ideas. While we are at a very early stage in our understanding of the fundamental mechanisms that govern change and growth in psychotherapy and other forms of intervention, how and why they work, emerging models of development in neuroscience point to the crucial importance of flexible approaches that potentially integrate disparate forms of therapeutic action across the foundational schools of thought. Clinical scholars focus on common factors that we believed to operate across all forms of intervention. We think, for example, about the crucial role of the relationship, the therapeutic alliance, and interactive experience. We also think about particular methods developed within particular schools of thought. And some researchers propose that different approaches engage different neuroanatomical structures instrumental in our experience of bodily sensation, emotion, imagery, thought, and behavior. For example, research in cognitive neuroscience suggests that the methods of free association or associative ways of working that we've developed in the psychodynamic tradition can often provide points of entry into domains of implicit memory and associative networks that operate out of awareness. asking what comes to mind can be useful. We can't report on our implicit networks that operate out of awareness. Although free association may be very helpful in exploring implicit networks, it may do little to illuminate or change explicit conscious beliefs or patterns of behavior that operate through the action of different networks. I'll be talking about this again in the second part of the morning. But for purposes now, I want to emphasize the importance of what we take to be common elements that operate across all forms of our work, and particular methods and approaches that may engage different neuroanatomical structures as we work to help connect domains of experience across, again, sensation, emotion, thought, imagery, and so on. Now, I think that we will find that the science of mind promises to enrich our understanding of the dynamics of behavior, promises to enrich the ways we think about different concepts of therapeutic action and change. But we know that neither neuroscience nor clinical theory can tell us what particular actions will be therapeutic, will be useful in a given situation. And this is part of what has moved me to think more about clinical pragmatism, trying to focus more on the process of intervention, the ways in which we think about experiential learning over the course of our work, and how clients make use of different elements as they work to negotiate vulnerabilities and problems in functioning. As students here at the university, we know that we can come to know how many things work in theory. But as we think about practice, we realize that it's often a very different experience. And part of what I'm trying to do is really help us think about the experiential aspects of our work. You know, I realize that we teach and we test more pure forms of psychotherapy in medical schools and university clinics around the world, randomized controlled trials. And researchers sometimes speak as if the question is what is therapeutic will be resolved by the findings of empirical research. I think these studies are very important. I think it's an empirical question, but it's one that we can only answer in the concrete particularity of the given case. We don't know how our clients are going to make use of different elements. And I want to look at the ways in which the principles of clinical pragmatism help us think about the formulations and the findings of neuroscience and theories of psychotherapy in light of what I think of as human actuality, again, our experience in the clinical situation. We challenge ourselves to reflect on the course of our work, wondering how might this next idea, this next question, advance our efforts to help at this point in light of what we've come to learn in our work together. Again, drawing on experiential learning. Is this particular action therapeutic in this particular situation? And these are the questions that I'm hopeful we can explore as we look at clinical pragmatism and the case that I'll talk about. I want to shift now and talk more about pragmatism. But before I go on, I want to ask if there are any questions by way of clarification. I'm not wanting to open up a larger discussion, but I'm wondering if there are any questions about what I've laid out so far that I might say more about. Any? Yes? I will not talk specifically about that, but I will want to include that in our discussion of potential ways of working as we think about regulation of experience, and would certainly welcome your observations at the end when we have a more general discussion about these concerns. So, thank you. Okay. Over the last 33 years, I've sat in these chairs. I've come to a lot of lectures. And I realize it's hard to assimilate and process many of these ideas. I've given you some handouts that develop these ideas further. I've given you an article that I wrote last year that will talk more about pragmatism. And I realize after a point it can feel like words coming at us. So bear in mind, we'll have a break and we'll pick up for the second half. But I want to talk more about pragmatism because I think it's so important for the field. I think that the pragmatic attitude has really shaped social work practice from the beginning. Pragmatism emerged as a distinctive American philosophy at the end of the 19th century, shaped largely by the writings of William James and John Dewey. Were they with us today, I am sure they would be deeply interested in the science of mind as they were in their time. Some people think of them as our first cognitive neuroscientists. They developed their own theories about experience and the mind in light of discoveries in biology. James certainly knew the lab intimately. He trained at Harvard Medical School. He taught anatomy for some years before he began to teach psychology and philosophy. And James and Dewey both wondered how the brain grows over the course of childhood and adolescence. Both of them felt that experience must continue to shape the development of the brain over the life course. And in this sense, they anticipate, our current conceptions of plasticity. They also anticipated Donald Hebb's idea that brain tissue that's activated together is more likely to stay functionally related thereafter. We'll be talking about Donald Hebb's axiom, neurons that fire together, wire together. So there were a lot of questions that they considered over the course of their work. There was recently a conference on neuroscience and pragmatism that as part of came out of a study group looking at pragmatism and neuroscience at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. But I'm also clear that James and Dewey would want us to think about emerging formulations and findings in neuroscience in light of particular concerns and questions that follow from their pragmatic attitude. James explains the term pragmatism, here's another etymological, originates in the Greek word of the same name meaning action, from which the words practice and practical come. And James and Dewey would want us to think about the practical outcomes of ideas in light of our particular tasks and projects. I want to just talk briefly about each of them before I outline some of the main points in a clinical pragmatism. James, can I just get a feel for how many of you are familiar with James's work or have read William James, just to get a sense? Okay. James was widely recognized as the leading American psychologist and philosopher at the end of the 19th century. As I said, he went to Harvard Medical School, taught anatomy before he began to work in psychology and philosophy. He became an academic celebrity, if we can speak of academic celebrities, after he published The Principles of Psychology in 1890. It's an extraordinary work and is certainly with us today, read as an exemplar of a more phenomenological approach to our efforts, as we try to understand the mind. He was much interested in religion and spirituality and explored this in The Varieties of Religious Experience, 10 years later, published in 1901. And he got more and more interested in pragmatism as he continued to write about psychology and religion. And his work generated more interest across readers because it spoke to an American disposition for practical thinking and concrete outcomes. In developing his pragmatic point of view, James acknowledges the limits inherent in human understanding. He urges us to approach our work from multiple independent perspectives. He's challenging any conception of reality that would divorce it from the concrete particularities of actual experience. For James, the world of everyday life is multitudinous beyond imagination. He says it's tangled, it's muddy, it's perplexed. He says it presents us with ambiguities, complexities, confusions, contradictions. He speaks not of a universe, but of a multiverse. He says that he rejects notions of grand theory, such as we find in Freud, for example. James actually hosted Freud and Carl Jung during their visit to Clark University in 1909, celebrating I think the 20th anniversary of the founding. And James said he was really uncomfortable with Freud. He called him obsessed by fixed ideas. And he said he was much more comfortable with Jung, who he felt really understood the plurality of human experience, and he felt was open to experience. But James is rejecting notions of grand theory based on what we take to be objective, absolute truths. He says there's no single point of view that can encompass the multiplicity, the complexity of our experience. We can't synthesize our experience into a unified whole. He says, at best, our theories offer fragmentary, provisional renderings of experience. So Jamesian pluralism urges us to think about different ways of seeing, different ways of understanding, different ways of acting as we approach our work. The root of theory, theoria, means to behold, to approach by indirection, to see. And we think about the ways in which theory enlarges ways of seeing. There's room for novelty, contingency, engagement of different ideas. We find equally valid points of view that inevitably contradict or challenge one another, yet lead to insight and understanding and action. Different ways of proceeding may converge, may give us a basis for belief for our best guess as to the truth of a matter. But we're also willing to accept the limits of our understanding. We're ever aware of the dangers of presuming to know too much. And James introduces this idea of fallibilism. He says we regard uncertainty and contingency as conditions of knowledge. He says, owing to the fact that all experience is a process, no point of view can ever be the last one. He often said the universe cast the last stone. For James, our ideas are tools for thinking. He says theories are instruments. Pragmatism unstiffens our theories, limbers them up, sets them to work. Those of you who've been in my courses since 2001 know that I often call upon a passage. Louis Menand did a wonderful history of pragmatism. It came out right after 9/11, October 2001. And has since been recognized as an extraordinary account of James and Dewey and other thinkers in pragmatic tradition. But he says basically, you know, we think of ideas as having no greater metaphysical status than, say, a fork. When our fork proves inadequate to the task of eating soup, it makes no sense to argue whether there's something inherent in the nature of the fork or something inherent in the nature of the soup that accounts for the failure. You just reach for a spoon. And my point would be that thinkers don't believe that ideas are out there waiting to be found in the pragmatic tradition. Rather, they're things that we develop to deal with the particular circumstances in which we find ourselves. They're like tools. They're like knives, forks, microchips that we call upon that help us out in different ways. Action and experience for James serve as the final test of beliefs and ideas. In his view, truth happens to an idea. It's made real. It becomes true through our experience. He says, in following the pragmatic method, we must bring out of each word its practical cash value, set it to work within the stream of our experience, he wants to think very much about the cash value of different ideas as he thinks about the practical outcomes. So he's rejecting abstraction, he's rejecting absolutes, he's rejecting fixed principles, closed systems. Instead, he says he's searching for fact. He's searching for concreteness, action, adequacy in light of our particular tasks and our particular projects. So he says, the true is the name of whatever proves itself to be good in the way of belief, and good, too, for definite assignable reasons. He says, if we take something to be true, what concrete difference will its being true make in anyone's actual life? What is the cash value in experiential terms? For James, the question isn't, is it true, but rather, how would our work be better if we were to believe it? What is the use of a truth? Many of the ideas that we'll be talking about in neuroscience are really set forth as hypotheses. They're proposals. There's a lot of speculative formulation. And I think, again, part of what we have to think about is how we potentially make use of these in light of our work. For example, research on common factors emphasizes the importance of developing conceptual schemes as we think together with the client about what is the matter and what carries the potential to help. And I believe that neuroscience certainly offers ways of thinking about our experience of difficulty that are very useful in a clinical situation, but which remain provisional, as we think about empirical support for some of these ideas. But I think that James would want very much to be asking, what good are these ideas in light of our work and our practice? Let me say a few things about John Dewey before we take a break. Can I just get a feel again for how many of you are familiar with Dewey's work or familiar with some of his writings? Some? Okay. Dewey was a public intellectual. He was a political activist. He was a social reformer. He drew on James's work in developing his accounts of pragmatism. His work really influenced social and political and cultural life through much of the 20th century. His work bridged the fields of psychology and philosophy. We know him best for his work in the field of education. He joined our faculty at the university, our Department of Philosophy. He was the chair in 1894. He established the lab school as an experiment in progressive education. He worked very closely with Jane Addams. He was very active at Hull House, and he continued to write in ways that inform progressive social and political and industrial practices in the early 20th century. He was very interested in the social surround, in what we think of as a social environment, and he was very interested in experiential learning. The principle of learning by doing, as he called it. And his work was influential in shaping the development of social work education. And as we think of our field work here at SSA, there are very direct connections to Dewey and these ideas, and many threads and lines of influence that we find between Jane Addams and Hull House and Dewey and the field of social work. Now, he agrees with James, that pluralist approaches to understanding are really important, but he moves beyond this in his formulations of pragmatism to think also about the crucial role of relationship and collaboration and experiential learning in our efforts to generate understanding and action. He argued that philosophers made a huge mistake, failing in their distinction between knowing and doing. And this is what moves him to introduce the principle of learning by doing. He thinks of them as indivisible features of the same process, which he says is fundamentally concerned with instrumental outcomes. He says our task is to raise questions, to try to figure things out, to act, to learn from experience. Experiential learning is an ongoing self-corrective process. He says we clarify and revise our conceptions of knowledge in light of changing circumstances and outcomes. I always share this with our students as they begin to go into the field about the self-correcting functions of experiential learning and a certain reassurance that we have. But what's important, as we know, is to generate the experience. I love this passage from Dewey. He says, experience is a process of undergoing. It's a process of standing something. He says, our undergoings are experiments in varying the course of events. Our active tryings are trials and tests of ourselves. His pragmatism is democratic and participatory in the sense that he conceives of learning and the development of understanding as a relational, collaborative activity. He talks about the importance of an open-minded, flexible, and deliberative habit of thinking and a collaborative give and take. He says, when we limit our conceptions of knowledge to textbooks or to talks, I would add, he says, we deprive it from the context of our experience and so compromise our relations with the world. And I know Dewey would be saying, get to the case, probably, I'm sure. And I promise I will get there. But I do want to try to lay out just a couple ideas as, again, a working formulation of clinical pragmatism. Sorry, this is dangerous, but. I'm going to try to summarize these briefly. I'm drawing on James's work and Dewey's work and trying to formulate, again, what I think of as a working understanding of clinical pragmatism. And I'm going to outline 4 areas that I think are central. The first one, focus on subjectivity and individuality in our conceptions of the person and what I think of as the human particularity of the helping process. And here I go back to Bernice Simon's essay on social casework where she talked about our commitment to the individuality of all. We conceive of the person as an individual. In the phrase of Oliver Sacks, we think about the ways in which we work to engage the person not as an object, but as a subject, as a human being first and last. Sacks speaks of the experiencing, acting, living I. Doing our best to understand the phenomenal realms of experience, the distinctive character of people and lives, taking account of the richness and the nuance and the complexity of the human context, thinking about what it means to be a unique individual. I'm not going to talk about James and Dewey in the ways that they develop these ideas, but know that they do. Dewey thinks of the individual as the carrier of creative thought, the author of action. He says the individual mind is the vehicle of experimental creation. He's much interested in notions of self-determination and agency that are so central in social work. So pragmatic values focus on the subjectivity of the individual, self-determination, and the circumstances of the helping process that defy categorization. I'd also want to acknowledge the crucial role of narrative and personal meaning as we think about all helping processes. What I would observe is that the pragmatic perspective challenges reductive approaches to care based on rigid adherence to particular models of intervention or particular commitments to technical procedures or empirical findings. We think about idiographic approaches based on our recognition and care of the whole person as an individual, rather than nomothetic approaches that impose rigid models of intervention. I think it's really important to aim for rigor in our practice, to call upon empirical work. But I think we also have to realize that hard-nosed and inflexible approaches, while perhaps evidence-based by certain readings, may undermine our efforts to help in the particular case. And I'll say more about this, again, when we look at the clinical material. Second, we think about the crucial functions of relationship and the collaborative nature of the helping process. We reaffirm the role of relationship, collaboration, egalitarianism, the fundamental importance of dialogue, open-minded, deliberative process between the worker and the client. As we think together about different approaches to our work, to care, trying to figure out what makes it better, what makes it harder, what seems to be working in the given situation. Our clinical formulations are provisional. They're shaped, again, by experiential learning and concrete outcomes. I talk about this in the article, the ways in which we've come to see a recalibration of the authority of the worker and the client in our conceptions of the helping relationship, challenging certainly views of the clinician as all-knowing experts. We think of both parties as vulnerable, fallible, capable experts. The ways in which we bring our authority of experience to bear and revise our understanding in light of ongoing outcomes. And certainly 80 years of process and outcome research continues to help us appreciate the fundamental role of the relationship and the alliance and interactive experience in determining outcomes. Again, the most predictive determinant of outcomes in our work. 3, we talk about pluralist approaches, again, bridging scientific and humanistic domains of understanding. Again, really recognizing the value of comparative approaches to understanding, working to master a range of perspectives, therapeutic languages, and methods of intervention. I realize we establish a home base, but what we would try to do from this perspective is to enlarge the range of our understanding and our practices in light of our clinical experience and ongoing learning. I hope to say more about that later as well. But what I do want to say for a moment is I want to emphasize the importance of thinking both about scientific and humanistic perspectives as we think about the knowledge base of practice, as we think about domains of understanding in social work. I've just said, I think it's really important to bring scientific rigor to our practice and to take account of empirical research in diverse fields of study, trying to figure out what's valid, what's sensible, and what's useful as we carry out our work. But I think it's equally important to recognize the critical role of humanistic values and understanding at a time when many of our renderings of help and care are shaped largely by reductive approaches to our work. In all of my courses, I use an essay Robert Coles wrote from a collection called The Call of Stories. And I also more recently include some writings by Martha Nussbaum, a philosopher here at the university, on the humanities. And the reason I do this is that I think the liberal arts help to challenge the abstractions of theory. They help to challenge the generalizations of empirical research. They enrich our faculties of reflection, imagination, emotion, empathy. They strengthen the ways we work to negotiate the ambiguities, ironies, complexities, contingencies of human experience. Help us think about the workings of fate and circumstance and fortune, good and bad. I think the sensibilities that we cultivate through stories that we read, stories that we hear from our clients, novels, poetry, art, music, film, and so on, deepen our abilities to help negotiate the experience of vulnerability, of limits, of suffering, and difference. Again, working to recognize and respect the individuality of the person. I have talked about the importance of experiential learning and practical outcomes. Again, the clinical process is guided by results rather than by our fixed commitments to particular theoretical systems, empirical findings, technical procedures. I would say that pragmatism works to validate our experience, encourages us to trust our judgments, to have faith. I think a lot about faith as we carry out our work. You know, the idea that if what we do is good enough, the rest will follow. So these are some ideas that, again, I develop more fully in the article. I'm working on a book project now and developing them much more. But I wanted to lay these out as a, I guess, a perspective that I certainly call upon as I approach work in neuroscience and work in clinical theory in light of our practice. What I'd like to do is take a break for 15 minutes. I'm going to, again, return to neuroscience, make some, again, some general observations about recent work, and then I want to look at the ways in which we've come to think about 5 domains of experience in therapeutic practice in light of formulations and findings in neuroscience. I'd like to lay out a case and then begin to think about that, as I was explaining, from different theoretical perspectives, thinking about the foundational schools of thought and looking at different points of emphasis as we think of different concepts of therapeutic action. In order to think about our practice from the perspective of neuroscience, we have to have a basic understanding of the core structures of the brain and the fundamental processes that mediate neural development. And I cannot give a full overview of the brain in the time that we have this morning, but I want to offer some starting points. For those of us who are new to the science of mind, I encourage you to explore a website developed by the National Institute of Mental Health that introduces the fundamental structures and functions of the brain. I've put it on the handout under resources. It's www.brainbasics.nimh. I think it's very good, and I'm not going to use my time this morning to go through the basic structures, but I encourage you to look at that. For those of you wanting to read, I think the best account of the brain is Dan Siegel's recent book, The Developing Mind, in the second edition published in 2012 by Guilford. And I'd be glad to talk with you about other references and resources afterwards. The brain encompasses features of organization. Oh, Kitty. Sure. Oh, it should be under the bibliography, under resources. After the... Oh, okay. Okay, we're... Okay. So, it's brain, if you Google Brain Basics, NIMH, it'll take you to it. Daniel Siegel also has a wonderful website on interpersonal neurobiology that, again, offers overviews. So we'll follow up with the reference, though. Other questions? Okay, so the brain, I was saying, encompasses features of organization and function that have moved neuroscientists to call it the most complex structure, natural or artificial, on Earth. Gerald Edelman, the Nobel laureate, describes it as, quote, the most complicated material object in the known universe. I have no training in neuroscience, and when I began reading in the field in the mid-1990s, I was surprised at how little we know about the organization, the development, and the functioning of the brain in spite of rapid advances over time. You know, I'm sure many of you have read about the brain activity map. As we talk now, neuroscientists are working on this project. It was conceived by government institutes here, the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation. Obama endorsed it as policy. The goal is a map of the activity of every neuron in real time. But again, I guess I continue to appreciate how little we know. And part of what moves me is just, a sense of wonder as we continue to realize what we have and what we don't know. What we register in our mind and our body as experience corresponds to particular patterns of neural activation in the brain. Patterns of neural firing create synaptic connections that organize the structures and functions of the brain. Now, the forms of these firing patterns are shaped by experience, and the dynamics of activation create particular configurations of sensation, emotion, imagery, thought, and behavior. I mentioned Donald Hebb's axiom earlier: neurons that fire together wire together. The idea, Hebb introduced this in 1949. He said, neurons that fire together at one time become associated and are more likely to fire together in the future. So in this sense, we think of the architecture of the brain as associational. What's interesting to me is that Freud actually proposed this idea very early in his career as a neuroanatomist in 1888, functionally linking the activity of neurons in his law of association. So it's certainly an idea that has been with us for a long time. We think of instantiations, the word means making the abstract concrete, as patterns of neural activity or memory representations that form a functional whole. Let me give you an example. Shortly after I was born, my mother worked and my grandmother cared for me through the week. And my grandmother was a gardener. And we spent a lot of time in the backyard. And now, 60 years later, the smell of a hyacinth, the yellow of forsythia, the sounds of blue jays and cardinals, the feel of grass, of damp earth, brings to mind my experience of her care. The encircling arms, the voice, the touch. And we think about the ways in which experiential conditions activate particular patterns of neural firing. And we know that experiential opportunities to continue to change the relationship of neurons within networks, influencing how we feel, what we do. I feel most at home in nature at this point, and over the years when friends would ask me, why are you a bird watcher, or why are you a member of the American Fern Society, I'd say, I like birds and I like ferns. And it was only much later that I was able to make these connections to my very early experience. And I was saying earlier, that we are not able to formulate and render our experience of much of what we sense and feel and carry into words. And we think about the ways in which we work to make the implicit explicit over time. But this idea of instantiation is very important. In the book I'm working on right now, I talk about the experience of Martha who I follow through the book, trying to illustrate different ideas. And I had worked with her for a couple of years, and she had found herself shopping in a store, was looking for a new bedspread, and opened a package and began running her fingers over the cloth. And as she did so, she explained she began to feel more and more unreal. And she became disorganized, began to experience a dissociation, and didn't know who she was, where she was, what time it was, you know. And over time, it was we were able to follow, you know, lines of association, what comes to mind now, and she was able in time to link up this experience with a very early experience of abuse, where she had been on a daybed on a sun porch, and there was a very similar fabric, but we would think about the ways in which the fabric had activated an instantiation, you know, or an implicit memory, as we would think of it, in the experience of sensation and emotion, and brought this to life. And when we think about, you know, the uses of these ideas, it was very helpful for Martha to be able to think about her experience in these ways to make sense of this not me experience. Our work had not focused, you know, on these concerns at all. So this is, I think, important as we think about the associational nature of development and these ideas as we think about instantiation. Sometimes researchers also use the phrase neural net profile as well to think about particular configurations of networks. I was talking earlier about the work of Eric Kandel. We continue to deepen our understanding of the ways in which nature and nurture shape the development of the brain. Neuroscientists distinguish template and transcription functions of genes in their accounts of the biological and the experiential conditions that influence the maturation of the structures. As templates, genes shape the development of core structures that we inherit through our DNA, but we know that the expression of many genes depends on experiential opportunities that activate their transcription. And so nurture shapes the development of the brain through the selective activation of genes that determine what we think of as experience-dependent domains of growth. And what Kandel's work shows is how experiential opportunities facilitate the expression of particular genes that activate the synthesis of proteins, instrumental in the development of neural structures, basically creating new neurons and expanding networks across existing neurons. Kandel is amazing. He's 84. He's continuing to carry out his research. He is trained as a psychiatrist and neuroscientist, and just did an extraordinary book on neuroscience and Freud and art in Vienna. An amazing book. There are wonderful interviews with Kandel. Charlie Rose did, actually. You can find them on YouTube, where he talks about his research as you're moved to explore his work. I want to briefly talk about integration. We use the term integration to describe basic processes that link the core regions of the brain into a unified whole, mediating homeostasis. We think of biological homeostasis. We think about states of self. We think about awareness. We think about adaptive functioning. From the perspective of interpersonal neurobiology, we think of the integration of neural networks as a crucial determinant of growth and resilience and health and well-being. Daniel Siegel has come to think of integration as the core mechanism of optimal living. And as I said earlier, we're assuming that the failure to differentiate systems in the course of development or to integrate neural networks underlies vulnerability, compromising capacities for self-regulation, for, thinking about different problems and functioning that we see across different forms of vulnerability and difficulty in psychopathology. Most broadly, we distinguish two fundamental domains of integration in our conceptions of the networks that govern brain function. We categorize these according to the vertical axis and the horizontal axis. The vertical axis refers to the core structures of the brain. We think about the brainstem, the limbic region, and the cerebral cortex. These are correspondingly the bottom and the middle and the top areas of the brain. And in reading the literature, we often see reference to bottom-up processes that originate in the brainstem and in the limbic system, and we think about top-down processes that originate in the cerebral cortex. We think, for example, about executive functions and so on. The horizontal axis refers to the right and left hemispheres. And again, we're assuming that integration of networks linking these systems mediates our experience of sensation, emotion, thought, imagery, and so on. And our capacities for emotional regulation and coping are closely linked with these conceptions of integration. I want to briefly talk about memory as well, because most of us don't really receive any training or background in memory. I've been talking about implicit memory, explicit memory, and I just want to say a few words about that before we move on. Over the last 25 years, researchers in cognitive psychology and neuroscience have documented multiple forms of memory. They differ in their neural architecture, in their developmental trajectories, they differ in the learning processes that we encompass in our understandings of them. Most broadly, we distinguish implicit and explicit memory. The structures of implicit memory are intact at birth. They're online, we think, perhaps in the 7th month of pregnancy. And we know that babies show capacities for recall through different forms of learning. We think about sensory experience, perceptual experience, emotional and behavioral domains of experience. In the first year of life, we register our experience and learning as unconscious, pre-symbolic memories in the amygdala. The amygdala is a structure in the middle, in the limbic region of the brain. And these implicit memories are global. They're disproportionately influential in shaping subjective states of self and our perceptions of others and the world. They're accessible only through our experience of sensation and emotion and behavior that represent crucial features of our experience. And we think of this, again, from the perspective of development as very early experience in the first year of life. But we also think about the ways in which trauma is going to register in these ways. For example, in the illustration of Martha that I just gave. So when implicit memories are activated, the instantiations engage circuits implicit memory that mediate different aspects of our experience. Implicit memory does not involve, I'm trying to summarize a lot, it does not involve the subjective sense of remembering something. The effects of previous experience are present here and now, but absent from any conscious memory. We act, we feel, we imagine without recognition of the influence of past events in our current experience. And in the clinical situation, we think about patterns of attachment, we think about transference reactions, we think about defensive forms of behavior, we think about fundamental attitudes toward the self, toward others, the assumptive world. And we can imagine certainly many of these as originating in very early states of mind, or as in later implicit memory. We don't have conscious access to the associative processes that mediate this experience. The hippocampus, also located in the limbic region, the middle brain, begins to mature in the second year of life. It serves crucial functions in the organization of explicit memory, and this involves conscious forms of learning that require focal attention. It's reflected in our ability to recall facts, ideas, and episodes in our life. It's often described as semantic memory, thinking about knowledge of general facts, or episodic, referring to memory for autobiographical events. You know, Martha, for example, could talk much about her early life, and she could relate accounts of her experience with her parents when we began our work, but there was much also that she was unable to render into words and relate. But I think from the perspective of neuroscience, a fundamental task is how we work to strengthen the integration of the networks linking unconscious and less conscious and conscious domains of memory, helping us make implicit memories more explicit as we render experience into words. I'd like to briefly shift, not briefly shift, I'd like to shift and then briefly outline ideas in 5 areas that focus our attention on the experiential opportunities of intervention, and then I'll move to the case report. And I've laid these out in the handouts. I realized at the start I did not orient you to the handout, but they're actually, let's see, beginning on the page, the top is the therapeutic relationship and interactive experience. I really, these are not numbered, my apologies. So I want to lay these out as a way of thinking about concepts of therapeutic action. We find the strongest conceptual links between neuroscience and psychotherapy in the field of interpersonal neurobiology. Daniel Siegel, Alan Shore, and other thinkers and researchers base their understanding of neural development and psychological development on attachment theory and research. We know that the attachment bond and early caretaking play a crucial role in the development of the brain. We think about integrative and regulatory structures, but we also, as we've been saying, appreciate the ways in which neural networks remain plastic through life. And researchers propose that the empathic attunement and the synchrony of the therapeutic relationship, the constancy of care in the holding environment, and the interactive experience of the therapeutic process, especially forms of communication mediated by the right brain, carry the potential to reinstate growth and development, strengthening our capacities to process and integrate experience and regulate emotion and engage in relational life. Researchers hypothesize that the core conditions of the relationship activate bonding processes instrumental in attachment, creating what Lou Casalino, an interpersonal neuroscience person, calls an optimal biochemical environment for plasticity. Dan Siegel proposes that the therapeutic relationship itself facilitates emotional regulation and well-being by enhancing the development in 2 areas of the cerebral cortex, the cortical limbic region and the orbital frontal region. You will read a lot about those if you read Siegel's work on development. Alan Shore, can I just get a feel for how many of you may have read Alan Shore's work? Okay. Again, very important as we think of work in attachment and neuroscience. More and more, he has focused on the crucial functions of unconscious, implicit, nonverbal, right brain functions as we think of the therapeutic alliance and interactive experience over the course of treatment. We know that the right brain is critical in processing what we think of as the music of our words. Prosody conveys nuances of meaning through variations in stress and pitch independent of our words. We think about the nonverbal elements of language: intonation, inflection, tone, pitch, force, and rhythm. These evoke states of self and implicit memory, Shore would propose. And more broadly, we think about our bodies, body movement, posture, gesture, facial expression as other forms of nonverbal communication. So the right hemisphere mediates more fundamental forms of communication in the therapeutic process, and right brain to right brain intersubjective transactions would appear to lie at the core of the therapeutic relationship, mediating what we think of as moments of meeting in our work. I would encourage you to explore Alan Shore's work as you're moved to think more about attachment and interactive experience in these ways. Second, we think about the importance of challenge and optimal stress and emotion. We've realized the crucial role of emotion in change and growth from the start of therapeutic practice. I think of Freud and Breuer in their account of the cathartic method, proposing that abreaction of trauma in full intensity will release emotion that's been split off and encapsulated and help us process and integrate experience. We'll see that concepts of therapeutic action across the foundational schools of thought work to intensify emotion through different approaches and methods. You know, we think, for example, in psychodynamic psychotherapy, we challenge defensive processes as we explore underlying emotion. We work to process interactive experience in the give and take of the relationship. We work to formulate our understanding of behavior, interpretive work. In classical cognitive approaches, we're going to challenge ways of reading experience that fail to take account of actual circumstances and realistic prospects. In behavioral models, we think about the phrase is exposure-based methods. I don't like that phrase because it makes the client passive, and the idea that one is exposed to things. But the idea that we work to engage what we're afraid of. We may be engaging feelings and sensations and states within us, or we may be more often, as we think of behavioral approaches, engaging experience outside of us in different ways. But the point is that we're working to intensify our experience of what we feel. And research shows that moderate levels of arousal and what we think of as optimal stress foster neurobiological conditions that promote plasticity and learning and integration. Moderate levels of arousal activate the production of neurotransmitters and neural growth hormones believed to enhance synaptic activity. The phrase that's often used is long-term potentiation, and learning and cortical reorganization. I think a lot about the experience of acceptance and challenge, the ebb and flow of emotion over the course of our work, which I think reflects underlying rhythms of growth and change. You know, in dialectical behavior therapy, we think about acceptance and challenge. Other models are going to emphasize these dialectics and tensions. 3, we think about efforts to engage sensation, emotion, imagery, and thought in the therapeutic process. Here, the idea is that simultaneous and alternating engagement of sensation and emotion and imagery and thought are fundamental as we work to foster the development of under-integrated networks that perpetuate dysregulation, dissociation, and dysfunction. You know, and I think, again, we realize the capacity to tolerate and regulate what we feel creates conditions for neural growth and integration through the life course, the idea that emotional regulation is what allows us to make use of naturally occurring experiences that foster growth, relationships, activities. And the assumption is that increased integration across these domains of experience parallels expanded capacities to experience and tolerate and make use of feelings and thoughts that we have managed through dissociation or other defensive processes. So we assume that ongoing activation of networks strengthens their integration. Again, this idea of working through in psychotherapy, I think, reflects this process. Again, I'm summarizing a lot in a way that isn't as articulate as I would wish. But the fifth area I just want to note, or the fourth area rather, is co-construction of narratives. We think about the ways in which we work to co-create narratives in the give and take of the therapeutic process, ways in which we assume the basic elements of narrative engage the core structures of the brain, thinking about our experience of emotion, imagery, thought, memory, and so on as we follow the storyline. And there's much interest in narrative and neuroscience in relation to these ideas. The final area that I, as a social worker, I think so much about the ways in which we work to try to create enriching experience in the outer world. And so I think a lot about the role of experiential learning and enriching relationships and activities and practices in the outer world as we work to help clients generate experience and engage relationships and activities and resources. So beyond the experiential opportunities of the therapeutic situation, we think about the role of relationships and activities that work to bring about change and growth. I make reference to Roger Walsh's account of what he thinks of as therapeutic lifestyle practices believed to promote neural development and health. These include exercise, meditation. We think about religious and spiritual practices. We think about artistic activities, really a range of practices. And I'm very interested in this and how we work to try to integrate this into our practices more as social workers. I think it's so important. And in the book, I have a chapter basically looking at work, for example, in music therapy, art therapy, movement, dance, just the range of practices and disciplines, and really trying to think more about this as we would carry out our work. I also think so much about Jane Addams and Hull House and some of the oral histories of experience there, the enriching surrounds that she created at Hull House, where we have, reading groups, theater groups. We're collecting garbage, but this range of experiences. And Jane Addams would say, we can be impoverished in many different ways. And she really tried to think about enriching surrounds and activities in these ways. So I'd like to shift, and in light of the ideas I just summarized, I'd like to talk about a case. In the article, I provide one account of our work together. We have, I'm going to be talking about Anthony. We've worked together for almost 8 years, over 3 courses of therapy with breaks. And the account in the article is I know all of our case reports are schematic, simplified. There's a narrative smoothing when we talk about a case, and I was trying to show how we could think about it from the perspective of pragmatism and call upon understanding across the foundational schools of thought. I want to talk about the case in a different way because rather than following the natural history of our work, I want to try to think briefly about concepts of therapeutic action across the schools of thought. and think about orienting perspectives in neuroscience. And I'll say a little more about neuroscience as we proceed. Anthony was 26 when I met him. He had developed really diffuse anxiety, dissociative states, signs of depression, more than a year after he had come back from military service in Iraq. He had been injured in an explosion when he was on patrol. He had what he had understood to be a severe concussion, massive internal injuries, multiple fractures of the spinal cord and both legs. He had a partial hearing loss. He had ongoing pain related to the back and leg surgeries for his injuries. He had completed a course of rehabilitation lasting almost a year in Washington after his recovery from life-threatening injuries, and he developed the symptoms that I described after returning to Chicago. He had moved into the home he had grown up in with his aunt. Now, in addition to the injuries that he had suffered in the explosion, he had witnessed the deaths of civilians and soldiers over the course of his service. He spoke of recurring dreams of running through endless fields of bodies. He was very frightened by the sudden onset of his symptoms, the intensity. He was unable to make sense of his experience, even though he knew things about trauma and he had learned about trauma in his rehabilitation program and in certain groups. This was beyond the bounds of what he had known. It was a not me experience of himself. I think often of Jerome Frank, who talks about a radical alienation from our experience of ourselves that follows trauma. In addition to the injuries and what he had experienced in Iraq, we find other sources of vulnerability in his accounts of his earlier experience in his developmental history. I should observe, I'm summarizing this, but I would just want to note it was very, very hard for Anthony to talk at all about his experience in our first meetings. And it, you know, I learned much of what I'm relating only over time. You know, when we think of trauma, there are often ways in which we really lose access to our capacity to formulate experience and relate experience. But I would come to learn that his mother had died suddenly when he was 6. She had an aneurysm. He and his younger brother were placed in foster care. They had a succession of caretakers. This did not go well. 2 years afterwards, his aunt adopted him and his brother, the sister of his mother. She was divorced. She seems to have been taxed beyond the bounds of what she could manage. And Anthony, in our work, would later describe ongoing worry that she too would die, as his mother had, or find herself unable to care for them, and then they would have to go back to foster care. So really living with this sense of worry and uncertainty. He struggled as a student, but he moved along. He graduated. He was not able to find what he described as work that meant something to him after he graduated. And while he was looking for jobs, his brother was killed as a bystander in a gang shooting. And at that point, he decided to join the Army. And as he would later reflect on it, he basically wanted out of his life as he knew his life to be. So that gives us some sense of his experience prior to Iraq. Now, the sense of vulnerability and dependency that he had experienced in the care over the course of his rehabilitation program, I think, had really intensified needs for closeness, for connection, essential others after his return. But he found himself avoiding his aunt, avoiding other family members, he said, for fear that they would ask him to talk about how he was feeling, and they would ask him to talk about his experience in Iraq. And he explains he has no interest in talking with anyone about anything, and he's talking with me only because he's unable to function. I mean, that's how we begin. So there'd been, again, a real sense of hopelessness, helplessness, dread, a sense that something bad is about to happen always, and he fulfilled diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, as we see. The nature of Anthony's symptoms could have led many of us, I think, to start to carry out a standard course of cognitive behavior therapy at the outset as we think of evidence-based practice guidelines for treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. But I think that such a prescriptive approach in itself would have been deeply problematic in light of his capacities, the range of his function, and I think reductive in light of the wider range of concerns that emerged over the course of our work. In the second course of our work together, which began after our first course lasted about 22 months, and then we had a break because he felt he was doing better, and we began about probably 7 or 8 months later. The second time I would learn that he had, before we began working, he had failed to follow through with an earlier effort to begin treatment through an outpatient clinic. He had had an intake appointment, and he had gone to a first meeting with a social worker, and what he described seems to have been more of a psychoeducational program and a more circumscribed cognitive behavioral approach. And I mean, part of what so much of the work in neuroscience helps us appreciate is that the way in which we carry out our work is much more important than the particular methods, I think, that we're using. And my sense was that, that Anthony did not make the connection and experience the attunement and holding that would have allowed him to begin his work. But my sense was that that it was important to be able to really think about his experience much more broadly. And in the article, I talk some about that. I'm going to talk about these perspectives in broad outline, these being psychodynamic, behavioral, cognitive, and humanistic, and try to look at the ways in which they focus our attention on overlapping concerns from different angles, different points of view. And I will talk about our work as I go here. Excuse me. I think of the psychodynamic tradition as my home base, and psychodynamic perspectives provided crucial points of reference for us as I drew on behavioral ideas and methods and cognitive ideas and methods and humanistic ideas and methods over the course of our work. But I was really trying to remain close to Anthony's experience of himself, what it was like for him to be himself as he was. So we think about subjective experience. We think about meaning, the ways in which Anthony is really trying to restore capacities to read and process and assimilate experience and generate meaning, but there are ways in which he's really, there's a singular way about his, the way he engages the world. Sorry, I just lost my microphone. Can you hear me okay? I'm sorry. Speaking of singular here. So the psychodynamic perspective provided a context for me, a home base. From a psychodynamic point of view, we try to think about the ways in which earlier patterns of attachment and caretaking, we think about relational life, we think about social surrounds, we think about restrictions of opportunity, we think of trauma and loss, how this experience shapes what we think of as self or what we think of as personality. we're thinking of feelings and thoughts and motivations that operate out of awareness as unconscious processes, perpetuating vulnerability and conflict. We've talked of implicit memory, that we register in what we sense and feel and do, rather than in what we're able to put into words and represent as memories. You know, Anthony has developed these symptoms more than a year after returning to Chicago. Why now? These symptoms in this way after he returns to his home where he's grown up. Thinking about, for example, the ways in which there may be implicit memories, thinking of his loss, thinking of other kinds of trauma, and so on. We're thinking about patterns of defense that mediate our efforts to regulate emotion and preserve cohesion and continuity and sense of self. We think of patterns of coping, adaptation, particular ways of being and relating and negotiating interpersonal life. We think about the meaning of symptoms and concerns in light of traumatic events, and again, earlier patterns of caretaking, relational life trauma, and loss. As we think of concepts of therapeutic action, we're emphasizing the sustaining functions of the relationship, the alliance, the constancy of care, and the holding environment, and the role of interactive experience in regulating emotion and generating sources of experiential learning. You know, so for example, from the perspective of self-psychology in the broader psychodynamic tradition, I'm focusing on Anthony's loss of cohesion and dysregulation, and the ways in which disruptions in relational life have perpetuated his experience of fragmentation and demoralization. He had a wonderful holding in his experience of the rehabilitation process in Washington. It was amazing, I think. And he lost that as he came back, very much alone, and ways in which he is very frightened, you know, as he thinks of engaging others here. And from the perspective of self-psychology, we think about the crucial role of relational life in regulating emotion, you know, thinking of cohesion and sense of self, and so on. We think of the crucial functions of right brain to right brain interactive experience that mediates synchrony and interactive repair after misreadings and lapses in attunement. I was speaking a few minutes ago of Alan Shore's work on attachment and the right brain, and thinking, for example, about nonverbal interactive experience. Anthony has a hearing loss, and I also have a slight hearing loss. And it was challenging for us as we began to work together. As you might imagine, I have a soft voice, and Anthony has a soft voice. And there was a lot of dyssynchrony as we were trying to find ways of talking together in this way. And I would say things, and Anthony wouldn't hear my words, but I think he would register my efforts to understand. I was very worried about his ability to form a therapeutic alliance, to really engage in our work together in light of his history of early loss, as we think of our understandings of attachment and the formation of the relationship, and so on. So in the article, I describe how other relational perspectives informed our work. I thought a lot about the holding environment of Donald Winnicott. His conception of the holding environment. It served crucial functions over the course of our work. Anthony was very reactive to sounds and smells and bright light. Bright light can activate what we think as phosphenes. They're like floaters or ocular, as we think of ocular migraines. And so, for example, as we think about his experience of the surround, it was very important for me to angle the blinds so that the morning sun would not hit him at points, to lower the setting on the light. A lot of implicit memory from Iraq was carried in his experience of sound and smell. And there was a point when our carpet was shampooed in the hallway, and the experience of the soap brought about a dissociative experience, so thinking very much about that. The building next to us was tuck-pointed, thinking about sounds. So I would offer him pillows. He did better with firmer pillows. But Winnicott emphasizes the importance of working to help us feel as comfortable as we can. You know, I'm always trying to think what's going to help Anthony feel a little more comfortable in himself, in the world, in our office. And I say more about that. Transference, countertransference states. As a child, you know, he's worrying that his aunt will die, and ways in which I imagined he had really come to experience his needs as a burden. And he was very attuned to what I think he perceived as requirements for conditions of care. And so there's a way in which he had really come to manage a lot of what he felt and keep it out of connection, out of relationship with others. And as we began working together, I felt as, you know, he would say he was fine, or I would ask him what he was feeling, and he would say nothing. And I realized that he was protecting me, I think, fearful that were he to talk more about his experience, that I would in some way be burdened or harmed. And so it was very important for me to challenge him and to help him bring this into our experience. So we think of transference experience and the ways in which, you know, ways of being are going to shape the course of our work. And I thought of transference and countertransference reactions as crucial sources of experiencing and understanding as we tried to process less conscious aspects of earlier trauma. Following lines of association. Anthony, what comes to mind as you talk about this? Or as he's talking about a thought or a memory, you know, trying to explore what he's feeling, what it's like, and so on, but trying to help him formulate his experience and make the implicit more explicit so that we can reflect upon it and develop a history together as we return and continue to find points of entry. Now, in the first phase of treatment, my sense was that it was the relationship, it was the holding environment, and my efforts to help, to be attuned in the ways that I could. And I think this, more than anything, helped him. He was not interested in behavioral methods as we might think of them in more traditional forms. He did not experience that at the start as helpful. I think the experience of coming, of taking the bus, coming to the office, moving into the world, and meeting twice a week as we did for those, you know, that first series, is much of what helped to organize him and create conditions that would then allow him to continue to work through traumatic experience. Now, I know we're close to the end, but I want to say some things about behavioral perspectives here, and the others briefly. Behavioral perspectives, as we know, really help us think about the ways in which patterns of learning and context and situational factors shape our behavior. We think about the content and the context of particular patterns of behavior. And we know that contemporary thinkers encompass the phenomenology of subjective experience in their conceptions of behavior. So we can think, for example, about physiological processes, sensation, emotion, thought, and imagery related to traumatic events as focal concerns in our work. And as I think of concepts of therapeutic action, part of what I was really doing is Anthony had more of a range, more self that he could bring to bear in our work. I would challenge him, and we would really try to focus on particular areas of experience that remain deeply problematic or that he was afraid to engage. There were memories, he would say, he knew he had in him that he couldn't put into words, didn't want to put into words, had no interest in remembering. And a lot of this experience trying to think of what would help him feel a little less frightened, and trying to think about the ways in which behavioral ways of focusing on experience, much of it internal, sometimes external, helped him work to experience what he was so frightened of of feeling. And part of what I love about behavioral perspectives are really the experiential nature of them. And I think about a lot of convergences with certain humanistic perspectives that I also love, again, because of the experiential way in which we try to move into our experience of our bodies, of sensation, as they relate to problems in functioning. And so we drew on what we would think of as exposure-based methods as we tried to explore and process and integrate aspects of his experience, as well as, I say, activities in the outer world. And we worked collaboratively over time in thinking about tasks that would provide occasions for him to challenge the way he had been avoiding experiences and relationships, expand patterns of activity, and carry out relational life. And here's where I drew on more active, task-centered methods of working. You know, for example, Thanksgiving, the first year we worked together, came up, and he wasn't going to go to Thanksgiving because he would have to talk with people. So it was helpful for us to think together about how he might begin to talk with, to talk with others. We think about ways in which we work to restore or develop capacities and skills through experiential learning. I think so much about third wave behavioral perspectives, acceptance and commitment therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, ways in which these helped Anthony to really live with his experience of what he was feeling and thinking, and work to accept them for what they were rather than reacting to them in ways that were predictive. I think about the ways in which he could disidentify with thoughts and relate to them in different ways. And again, I'm not able to say more about this, but we think of how these methods are described in acceptance and commitment therapy. Very helpful at points. An observer watching us might not think of what I was doing in light of these perspectives, but the point I'd want to make is that these ideas are in me as I'm thinking about ways of working. And I think as we look at comparative perspectives, our different schools of thought bring different points of emphasis and different ways of using the processes that we're involved in. Cognitive perspectives, I'm uncomfortable with the classical cognitive perspective of, I think of Aaron Beck, who I very much appreciate in many ways. He's still working at 94, and he's saying, whatever works in cognitive therapy, I don't think it's the cognitive stuff, I think it's the relationship. Just very recently, he's been talking about this, as some of you may know. But what I'm uncomfortable with is that it puts the clinician in the role of an arbiter of reality, and I'm much more comfortable with contemporary constructivist cognitive views, as we find, for example, in the work of Michael Mahoney, Sharon Berlin, and other thinkers that help us think about the ways in which we co-create meaning and think about the functional outcomes of different thoughts. And these helped us focus on certain ideas that Anthony would return to in ruminative ways, like nobody really wants to spend time with me, I'm a downer, automatic thoughts like my life is over, I'm broken, I don't matter. Ways in which we really tried to, first of all, formulate these, put them into words, and then challenge them. There's much work in neuroscience looking at the ways in which we try to engage cognitive processes as we think of top-down forms of integration. What I would observe is that neuroscience findings suggest it's really important to engage not only a cognitive process, the dorsolateral region of the cerebral cortex is what we think of as the home of the rational mind. But there's another area, the prefrontal middle area, that has dense connections with the limbic system. And as such, it works to regulate emotion. And if we're able to connect the cognitive, not just thinking about difficult thoughts, but also trying to engage the experience of the emotion at the same time, the assumption is that we work to strengthen integration and regulation. So I always think about this in relation to cognitive perspectives and how we potentially strengthen ways of working in light of these. Humanistic perspectives, I think, offer much, and I feel badly that we don't teach Rogers and think about the range of thinkers in the broader humanistic tradition. I think as we look, for example, at Rogers' efforts to paraphrase, to reflect, experience, and really trying to clarify, that's engaging cortical structures. We're engaging language-based cognitive functions as we really try to put words to our feelings, to our states. And I think Rogers, in certain ways, helps us to think about, again, optimal conditions for plasticity and really ways of reorganizing experience in his ways of working. But the simultaneous activation of emotion and cognition, I think, is very important. I also would mention the work of Les Greenberg, experiential approaches, and that of Eugene Gendlin that some of you may be familiar with, formerly on our faculty in philosophy and human development here. So these are some ways we think about, again, working to regulate emotion. I'd also observe that in later stages of our work, we called upon existential and humanistic perspectives as Anthony was able to begin to explore the meaning and the implications of his experience, trying to figure out what mattered more, trying to clarify values. And the way we came to think about it, he says the world is a dangerous place, and it's very hard for him now to live in the world. He says, we can be hurt, we die, things happen. And the question is, since we are human and since we are vulnerable in these ways, what is it that I have to do to fulfill my desire to live? And that's a question that's been very helpful for him as he continues to think about what he's going to do, how he's going to shape his life. I mean, he's currently on disability, but he's hopeful that he'll be able to go back to school. And but this idea of values, and finding the ways in which these help to motivate. I'm thinking about acceptance and commitment therapy, for example, and how important it is to clarify values and to think about what gives shape and direction to one's experience. So I have easily another hour of material. I was gonna, and I said I was going to do it in broad outline. I didn't know how broad, but my hope is that that this might offer some starting points as you reflect on your home bases, on the ranges of your practice, and that, I think it's so important for us to continue to challenge ourselves in different ways and to affirm what we do bring. I mean, I appreciate we have limits, we have ranges, and but to continue to grow and remain alive as we are. I mean, we wouldn't be here at Alumni Work Weekend if we weren't alive in these ways. I'd be glad to think about questions. I know there was a question about feedback. Are there, and I would certainly think about that, again, in terms of regulation, as we've talked about different approaches. Are there other questions? I know it's all noon, but I'd be glad to try to think about concerns. Yes?
In this case, I was wondering what Anthony's ethnic background is and how that had a play in your relationship.
Anthony's African American. And he, I said earlier that I wanted to think very much about context. He's grown up in what we would think of as very impoverished surrounds, a lot of violence, thinking of his brother. I mean, there's a way in which that's part of an assumptive world for him. And Anthony, I think in certain ways, disidentified with certain healthcare providers and organizations that would have otherwise been in a position to help him. There's a way in which I think Anthony wanted to, he would not put it this way, but I think he was looking for something that was very different from what he had known in certain ways. You know, geographically, he travels out of his neighborhood and travels through the city, you know, and so thought a lot about, I think a lot about context, and I think about the ways in which he works to enlarge the range of his experience of the world. But in terms of explicit, you know, content or discussion, I follow Anthony's lead, you know, and we have really focused more on what it's like for him to live in the home and in his neighborhood. And there are certain places he's found that he, I think, finds restorative. Like, I guess I could say a Garfield Conservatory, for example, certain places he can go. He'd become afraid of public space, of green space, you know, in these ways. So, does that speak?
I was thinking more into how it had an impact, or how you may have interpreted it as a factor in your therapeutic relationship.
Yeah, I really tried to be open to his experience, think with him as I had questions, but again, it's not an explicit theme or concern that was there. I mean, again, in starting where he is and continuing to follow. Something I think about a lot, certainly. So. Other questions? Amy.
I think that was one right there.
Annie. Oh, I'm sorry. Sean.
Okay. Let's. My question is this: can you discuss a little bit about the physical pain from Anthony's injuries and recovery? What his experience with treatment for the physical pain has been? What his experience with treatment providers for that physical pain, and how those two aspects have impacted his recovery and work with you?
He's on medication for the pain, though much less of it at this point. He has been followed by physicians in the VA for his medical care, and so it's been managed through that. At points, the medication has really compromised his ability to process experience, and certainly that's been an ongoing concern. I didn't explain, he is not paralyzed from the injuries, though he broke, you know, his spinal cord, his back. But are there particular thoughts that you're thinking of in?
So being an employee of the VA and working in both medicine and having worked in mental health, we find that often many of the veterans that we have the hardest time treating successfully are, now I don't know if Anthony has used substances, but veterans that have PTSD, I don't know if Anthony applies to Anthony's substance abuse issues, and have physical pain that tends to have a major impact. We find that, unfortunately, a lot of veterans who do have physical pain from multiple injuries and experiences in the military and post and prior, often they will come in, and unfortunately a lot of physicians and nurses and staff that are really not trained in working with physical pain will automatically assume, well, this veteran is malingering, or they're exaggerating, or they're actually going through some sort of substance withdrawal, or they're trying to acquire substances, when in fact they have in many cases, very serious underlying medical condition, that one of the known symptoms is pain, and they forget to screen it. Maybe there's a condition for that. So I think that alienates a lot of veterans from the VA, and it alienates a lot of veterans from providers in general, like, well, why am I going to see someone because they're not going to listen to me or care anyways?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if that has had an impact on your work, if he's had a negative experience with having his pain treated, and if that's had an impact with him being able to trust and relate to you as a provider.
I don't think that.
Even though you're not physically treating his pain, but.
Yeah. I think he feels as if he has been cared for in these ways. I really appreciate the concerns you're describing. I should explain, I've tried to encourage him to think more about groups, for example, at the VA, and using more services. And he's very clear that he wants certain things and doesn't want others in these ways. And again, just so, but I understand, and I understand certainly the substance, the dual, the substance use and concerns. With Anthony, that has not been a problem. I did not explain this. He also has a seizure disorder and is also on medication for that as well, following the injuries. So, Annie.
So I had a question about mindfulness. You spoke a lot about different therapeutic lenses, and in my own work with people surviving trauma and well, a whole host of things, I've integrated, and the work of Daniel Siegel has influenced the use of mindfulness into my practice. And I was wondering if you've used that at all with Anthony, or how you see that fitting into this.
I have tried to use certain practices, for example, I think of breathing. Anthony is very reactive to anything that he might experience as a technique. It feels like he will ask me, what have you been reading? Who you been talking to? Or what are you smoking? Is what he'll ask. And I think of another client who described my effort to introduce the possibility of a practice as an implant in our work. And we have to think very much about the implications of the techniques or methods that we might introduce in the course of our work, because the context of our work is changed when we do this, as we know. And so, with Anthony, for example, I found myself saying, when he might, for example, be very frightened, I would say, Anthony, when I find myself frightened, one thing that helps me is to focus on my breath. And when I start to focus on my breath out gets longer, because then again, we think of mindfulness practices and the ways in which we focus on our breath. And we know that that reduces the activity of the amygdala and calms the body. And so I could use myself in that way and try to introduce certain ways of working. I gave him some things to read on mindfulness practices, and he's, again, following it. And so again, part of what I emphasize, and part of why I wanted to talk about clinical pragmatism, is we think about what we make use of, what our ranges are, and how very important it is to avoid, again, a kind of top-down, nomothetic, prescribed course of treatment. I love mindfulness practice. I think it's great, and I try to introduce elements as I can. But with Anthony, I tried to think about how our experience of just being together, sitting there, thinking about right brain to right brain interactive experience was a regulation, a form of regulation that he was really able to make use of. And so, again, I have a lot of interest. And would you want to say more about your use of mindfulness, or?
Well, like you said, it just depends partly on who the client is and how they're, how open they are to it. I find some people want stuff to do. They don't
Yeah.
want you to just sit there and say, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I use a variety of different techniques about it. It could be as simple as let's take a breath together, depending on what's happening in the room, to some people really can't. They have trouble going through just a simple breathing exercise. So I'll integrate something that I learned from a yoga teacher, which is using finger counting breaths, following a spiral pattern on your hand, and kind of integrating a different sense of that is I'll actually draw a picture of my own hand. It's almost like a transitional object. And then I'll write the numbers on the spots on my hand on the picture of where they're supposed to touch to follow the pattern and give that to them.
Yeah.
So I have found that to be helpful. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think about, again, the ways in which we really try to call upon different ways of working and carry out experiments in adapting to need in these ways. As Winnicott would have it, I think of his squiggle game as we would co-create, an experience, drawing on paper together, the worker and the client. But again, again, what moves me to think about clinical pragmatism is how we draw on these different elements in light of our experience, the experiential learning that occurs over the course of our work. And again, we can, as I said, we can never assume that clients will be able to make use of elements that may be very helpful to others in these ways. But to think about, decision-making in light of our experience, and again, to work to learn, more theories, more ways of working as we can within our ranges. We have more to bring to our work in these ways. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I think we're out of time.
Yeah, so we're going to take one more question.
It's just
right over here.
Just a quick one, thank you. And it sounds like the mindfulness, by the way, was built into it, whether it was labeled as such or not all along. But you mentioned the hearing impairment, the hearing loss that Anthony has. And I was just wondering, unless I missed it in the literature, was this a developmental thing or a trauma-induced hearing loss from the injuries in Iraq? Yeah. The IED.
Yeah, exactly.
That's kind of what I thought, but some people have them earlier. So
yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much.